What if one bowl of soup could change your entire life? The snow had started just after 10 p.m., thick wet flakes drifting through the streets of Brooklyn and melting against the neon lights above Russo's bakery. By midnight, the sidewalks looked like rivers of gray slush, and my shoes were soaked through badly enough that I couldn't feel my toes anymore. My fingers trembled around the paper bag tucked beneath my arm as I stepped out of the diner after another double shift that paid less than my exhaustion deserved. 25 years old, 3 part-time jobs, overdue medical bills stacked on my kitchen counter, and a mother who needed medication I could barely afford. That was my life. Small, tired, hanging together by coffee and denial. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and started toward the subway station when I noticed him sitting beside the bakery window. The old man looked like winter itself had carved him out of stone. Thin gray coat, snow dusting his shoulders, hands shaking slightly as he stared through the glass at the rows of fresh bread inside the bakery. Most people walked past him without slowing down. A couple in expensive coats crossed the street just to avoid him entirely. The old man didn't ask for money, didn't speak. He just sat there in silence with the kind of exhaustion that looked deeper than hunger. I should have kept walking. God knew I couldn't afford generosity. My checking account had $18.42 left until Friday, and I still needed to buy my mother's heart medication tomorrow morning. But something about the way his hands shook made my chest ache. Maybe because I'd seen my mother's hands tremble like that after chemo treatments. Maybe because loneliness recognizes itself. I stopped outside the bakery and stared at the menu taped beside the door. Chicken noodle soup, bread roll, small coffee, $12.70. Nearly everything I had left. You're an idiot, Claire, I whispered to myself before pushing the door open anyway. 10 minutes later, I stepped back into the cold, carrying a white paper bag that smelled like rosemary and fresh bread. Steam curled from the soup container as I approached him carefully. Sir, my voice came out softer than I intended. The old man looked up slowly. Pale blue eyes met mine, startlingly sharp beneath thick silver eyebrows. Not confused, not weak, sharp, like he noticed everything. I thought maybe you were hungry. For a second, he just stared at the bag in my hands. Snowflakes melted against the shoulders of his dark wool coat, while traffic hissed through the slush behind me. Then he asked quietly, "Why would you help a stranger?" I tried to laugh, but it came out tired. Because nobody should sit in the cold starving. His gaze lingered on my face long enough to make me strangely nervous. Up close, I noticed details that didn't match the image of a homeless man at all. The watch beneath his sleeve looked old but expensive. The leather shoes under the snow were Italian. Real Italian. Not department store knockoffs. And despite the cold, despite the exhaustion carved into his features, he carried himself like someone used to being listened to. What's your name? He asked. Claire. Claire Bennett. He repeated slowly, like memorizing it. I frowned slightly. How did you know my last name? A faint smile touched his lips as he accepted the soup from my hands. You wear your diner name tag on your coat. Heat rushed to my cheeks immediately. Right? Sorry. Long night. He opened the soup carefully, and for the first time since I'd walked over, something softened in his expression. Not happiness exactly. More like surprise. Thank you, he said quietly. People don't usually stop anymore. The wind cut sharply down the street, making me shiver. I shoved my frozen hands into my pockets and offered him a small smile. Well, somebody should. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. Claire. I looked back. Snow drifted between us beneath the yellow glow of the bakery lights. Be careful walking home tonight, he said softly. This city becomes dangerous after midnight. I almost smiled at the irony. A starving old man warning me about danger. But something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The subway station smelled like wet concrete and burnt coffee, the kind of scent that settled into your clothes after midnight in Brooklyn. I sat near the back of the nearly empty train with my coat wrapped tightly around me, trying to ignore the ache in my feet as the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. My phone buzzed in my pocket again. Landlord. Third voicemail tonight. I did not listen to it. I already knew what it would say. Rent overdue. Final warning. Empty threats dressed up as professionalism. Outside the train window, the city blurred past in streaks of white snow and yellow streetlights. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on anything else, I kept thinking about the old man outside the bakery. The way he spoke. The way he watched people. Calm. Controlled. like he was studying the world instead of surviving it. Most homeless people I had met looked invisible after enough years on the street. He did not. He looked like someone pretending to disappear. By the time I reached Queens, the snowstorm had grown worse. Wind howled between apartment buildings hard enough to sting my face as I hurried down the block toward my building. The neon sign outside the laundromat flickered weakly across the street, casting red light over the icy sidewalk. I was halfway up the apartment stairs when I heard coughing behind me. Deep. Painful. My mother. I unlocked the apartment quickly and stepped inside the tiny one-bedroom unit that smelled faintly like medicine and canned soup. "Mom," I called softly. Another cough answered from the couch. Helen Bennett lay buried beneath two blankets near the radiator, her gray cardigan hanging loosely from shoulders that looked smaller every week. The television played quietly in the background, some late-night rerun neither of us was actually watching. "You are late," she whispered with a tired smile. "Double shift." I forced my voice cheerful and knelt beside her. Her skin felt warm. Too warm. Anxiety tightened instantly in my chest. "Did you take your medication?" Her eyes drifted away from mine for half a second. That was answer enough. "Mom." "Claire, sweetheart, we needed groceries." My stomach dropped. "You skipped your medication to buy groceries?" It was only one dose. One dose matters. Frustration hit me so fast it made my hands shake. Not anger at her. Never her. Anger at bills. At hospitals. At a world where medication cost more than rent. I stood quickly and crossed to the kitchen counter where unpaid notices sat stacked beside the microwave. Electricity warning. Medical debt. Final reminder. Every envelope felt heavier than the last. "I can pick up more hours," I whispered mostly to myself. "Claire." My mother's voice softened. "You are already disappearing." I leaned both hands against the sink and closed my eyes. She was right. I had stopped sleeping properly months ago. Some mornings I could barely remember driving home. But exhaustion was cheaper than losing her. A loud knock suddenly echoed through the apartment. 3 sharp hits against the front door. My entire body tensed immediately. Another knock followed, louder this time. "Mr. Collins," my mother whispered nervously. Of course it was. I moved toward the door slowly and opened it just enough to see my landlord standing in the hallway wearing a thick winter coat and an expression already irritated. "Miss Bennett," he said coldly, "you ignored my calls." "I have been working." "You are 2 weeks late on rent." I swallowed hard. "I can pay part of it Friday." "That is not enough anymore." His eyes shifted past me into the apartment. "I cannot keep making exceptions because of your mother." Shame burned hot across my face. "Please," I said quietly. "Just another week." He sighed dramatically before reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a folded paper. "Eviction notice." My chest tightened so fast I almost could not breathe. "I did not want it to come to this," he muttered. "But business is business." He turned and disappeared down the hallway before I could respond. I stared at the paper in my trembling hands while the snowstorm rattled the apartment windows behind me. Then, from somewhere outside down on the street below, black headlights slowly cut through the falling snow. The headlights stayed parked across the street for almost 10 minutes. I noticed them while pretending to read the eviction notice for the 5th time, my fingers tightening around the paper every time the wind rattled the apartment windows. Black SUV. Engine running. Tinted windows too dark to see inside. Expensive enough to look out of place in our neighborhood, where most people drove dented Hondas or prayed the subway stayed on schedule. "Claire," my mother asked softly from the couch. I forced myself to look away from the window. "It is nothing." But it did not feel like nothing. Something about the vehicle unsettled me in a way I could not explain. Maybe because men with cars like that did not sit outside buildings like ours unless they wanted something. Around 1 in the morning, the headlights finally disappeared into the falling snow. I barely slept after that. My mattress creaked every time I turned over, my mind replaying bills, overdue rent, and the image of the old man holding that cup of soup beneath the bakery lights. By 6:30, I gave up entirely and dragged myself out of bed for my morning shift at Holloway Cafe downtown. The city looked washed gray beneath the storm clouds, slush spraying against the sidewalks as taxis rushed past. My body felt heavy from exhaustion. My bank account felt worse. The lunch rush hit hard around noon. Businessmen shouting into phones. Tourists complaining about coffee prices. Someone spilled caramel syrup across the counter while another customer yelled because his sandwich had tomatoes on it. Normal Manhattan chaos. I moved through it automatically, balancing trays and forcing polite smiles even while my feet screamed inside my shoes. Table 7 still needs waters. My manager snapped as he brushed past me. And smile like you mean it, Claire. I nodded without arguing. Tips depended on pretending life did not hurt. I grabbed a coffee pot and headed toward the corner booth near the window. Then I froze. The old man from outside Russo's bakery sat alone at the table. Same silver hair. Same sharp blue eyes. But today he wore a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. The expensive watch I had noticed last night gleamed beneath his sleeve as he calmly stirred black coffee. He looked completely different in daylight. Cleaner. Straighter. Powerful somehow. My pulse stumbled unexpectedly. You found me. I blurted before I could stop myself. A faint smile touched his mouth. You wear your cafe logo on your jacket too. Heat rushed into my cheeks again. Right. You look tired, Claire Bennett. The way he said my full name made me strangely aware of everything around us. The noise. The clinking dishes. The cold rain streaking the windows. I picked up the coffee pot mostly to give my trembling hands something to do. Can I get you anything else? Sit for a moment. I blinked. I am working. Then consider it a break. Something in his tone carried quiet authority. Not rude. Just accustomed to being obeyed. Against my better judgment, I slid into the booth across from him for exactly what I intended to be 30 seconds. You should not spend money on strangers when your own life is falling apart, he said calmly. Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. What? He lifted the coffee cup slowly. Your landlord delivered an eviction notice last night. I spread down my spine. How do you know that? His expression remained unreadable. New York is smaller than people think. Fear flickered quietly beneath my ribs for the first time. Not panic. Worse. Awareness. The awareness that this man knew things he should not know. Who are you? I whispered. Before he could answer, the bell above the cafe door chimed loudly. Conversations around us seemed to soften all at once. I looked up automatically and felt my breath catch. 4 men in dark tailored coats entered the cafe together, snow melting against polished black shoes. They moved with calm precision, scanning the room without speaking. Dangerous was the only word my brain could find. Then another man stepped inside behind them. Tall, broad shoulders beneath a black cashmere coat. Dark hair swept neatly back. Sharp jawline. Pale green eyes colder than the storm outside. The entire cafe seemed to shift around him without understanding why. Even my manager stopped talking mid-sentence. The man's gaze moved through the room once before landing directly on me. Not curious. Not surprised. Intent. Then the old man beside me smiled slightly and said the words that made my heartbeat stop. My son is here. The air inside the cafe changed the second the tall man walked in. Conversations lowered without anyone understanding why. Even the espresso machine suddenly sounded too loud against the silence settling across the room. I felt it everywhere. In the way people glanced up nervously before looking away. In the way the 4 men behind him spread out naturally near the entrance like they had done this 1,000 times before. Protection. Control. Power. The stranger's dark green eyes stayed fixed on me as he crossed the cafe floor with calm, measured steps. Expensive black coat. Silver watch beneath his sleeve. The kind of presence that made ordinary people instinctively move aside. My pulse hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then he stopped beside our booth. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. Maybe 6'3". Sharp cheekbones. Dark hair touched faintly with snowflakes that melted slowly against the collar of his coat. But it was his eyes that unsettled me most. Cold at first glance. Calculating. Like he could read every fear hiding behind someone's smile. Father, he said quietly. The old man beside me looked mildly amused. You took your time, Adrian. Adrian. The name settled heavily in my chest. Italian. Powerful. Dangerous. Somehow I already knew all 3 before anyone said another word. Adrian's gaze shifted back toward me. You are Claire Bennett. Not a question. I swallowed hard. How do you know my name? One corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. My father does not stop talking about you. The old man chuckled softly beside me while I stared between them in complete confusion. Wait, I whispered. You are really his son? Adrian unbuttoned his coat slowly before sliding into the booth across from me. The movement was smooth. Controlled. The kind of confidence money could not buy unless power came with it. I am. My manager suddenly appeared beside the table, so fast it startled me. Miss Bennett, he said nervously. You can take your break as long as needed. His voice carried an almost painful politeness I had never heard before. Adrian barely glanced at him. Thank you. The manager nodded. Quickly and practically fled. I looked back at Adrian in disbelief. What just happened? People become accommodating when they know who they are speaking to, he replied calmly. And who exactly are you? For the first time, real emotion flickered faintly across his face. Tiredness maybe, or annoyance at the question itself. The old man answered instead. My son owns several businesses in the city. Several businesses. Right. That explained the suits, the security, the SUV outside. But it did not explain the tension tightening low in my stomach or the way every instinct I had screamed that these men were connected to something much larger than business. Adrian studied me quietly for a few seconds before speaking again. You spent your last $12 feeding my father. Heat rushed to my face immediately. You followed me. I protect my family. The words came out simple, direct, absolute. Something about the way he said family made the cafe suddenly feel smaller around us. I did not do it for a reward, I said quickly. I know. His eyes held mine steadily. That is why this conversation matters. The old man sipped his coffee while watching us both with open interest, like this was some private experiment unfolding exactly the way he expected. Outside the cafe windows, snow drifted heavily across the streets while black SUVs idled near the curb. My heartbeat still had not slowed down. Claire, Adrian said softly, and hearing my name in his voice sent an unfamiliar chill down my spine. Do you know what most people did when they saw my father sitting alone last night? I shook my head carefully. Nothing. The single word landed heavily between us. Adrian leaned back slightly, one hand resting against the table beside untouched coffee. They ignored him. Some laughed. One man told him to get away from the bakery entrance because he was hurting business. His expression darkened almost imperceptibly. You were the only person who stopped. I looked down at my hands, suddenly self-conscious. It was just soup. No, Adrian said quietly. It was kindness. Silence settled over the table again. Then Vincent Moretti smiled faintly into his coffee cup and murmured the sentence that made my blood run cold. Tell her the rest, Adrian. The snow outside thickened against the cafe windows while silence settled heavily around our table. I stared at Vincent Moretti, then back at his son, trying to understand why my instincts kept screaming at me to leave, while another part of me could not look away. Adrian rested one hand loosely beside his untouched coffee cup, calm and perfectly controlled. Men like him were dangerous in the quietest ways. The rest? I asked carefully. Vincent leaned back in the booth with surprising ease for someone who had looked half frozen on a sidewalk 12 hours earlier. Every December, he said softly, I spend 1 week outside without security, without drivers, without anyone knowing who I am. My confusion deepened. Why would you do that? Adrian's expression darkened faintly. Because my father believes money reveals character. Vincent smiled slightly. No, lack of money reveals character. I frowned. I do not understand. Most people are kind when there is something to gain, Vincent continued. But kindness without reward? That is rare. His pale blue eyes locked onto mine again. You gave away your last $12 to feed someone you believed could never repay you. Heat crept slowly into my face. Hearing it said out loud made the choice sound foolish instead of normal. It was not a big deal. Adrian finally picked up his coffee. To us, it was. The words landed heavier than they should have. I shifted uncomfortably beneath his gaze. Look, I appreciate whatever this is, but I really need to get back to work. Your manager already approved your break, Adrian replied calmly. That is not the point. For the first time, something almost amused flickered in his eyes. Tiny. Gone within seconds. You are uncomfortable around me. Should I not be? The question escaped before I could stop it. Vincent laughed quietly into his coffee while Adrian studied me with unreadable calm. Probably, he admitted. Honesty. Somehow that unsettled me more than denial would have. I looked toward the cafe counter where my co-workers pretended not to stare at our table. Everyone could feel something strange happening here even if they did not understand what. Outside, black SUVs still lined the curb beneath falling snow. What exactly do you want from me? I asked softly. Adrian answered immediately. Nothing. I blinked. Then why am I sitting here? Because my father insisted. Vincent nodded once. I wanted to meet the woman who still has a heart in this city. Embarrassment mixed strangely with fear inside my chest. Nobody had called me kind in a very long time. Mostly people call me tired, broke, late on rent. You make me sound better than I am, I whispered. Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. You took food away from yourself to help a stranger. His voice lowered. Most people with your problems would not have done that. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed violently across the table. Landlord again. My stomach tightened instantly. Adrian noticed the reaction immediately. Of course he did. Men like him noticed everything. You are being evicted, he said quietly. Not a question. I stared at him in disbelief. How do you know so much about me? Because after my father told me about you, Adrian replied calmly. I asked questions. Cold rushed through me. You investigated me? I made sure you were safe. That is not normal. His expression remained perfectly still. My life is not normal, Claire. The way he said my name sent another strange chill down my spine. Not flirtation. Something heavier. Intentional. Before I could respond, the cafe doors opened again. Two men in expensive suits entered quickly, snow melting off their shoulders. One of them leaned down beside Adrian and spoke quietly in Italian. I did not understand the words, but I understood the effect instantly. The temperature around the table changed. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes grew colder. Dangerous again. He stood slowly from the booth, every movement controlled. Stay here, he said. Excuse me. 5 minutes. I do not take orders from strangers. For the first time since entering the cafe, Adrian looked directly into my eyes with something almost intense enough to steal the air from my lungs. Claire, he said softly, I am trying very hard to be polite today. Then he buttoned his black coat and walked toward the exit while snow swirled violently outside the cafe windows behind him. The cafe felt strangely empty after Adrian walked out. Even though every table was still full, I could still feel the weight of his presence lingering in the air like expensive cologne and winter smoke. Outside the windows, snow whipped violently across the street while black SUVs waited along the curb with engines running low beneath the storm. Vincent Moretti calmly stirred sugar into his coffee, as if none of this was unusual. As if men in tailored black coats did not move around him like shadows. I stared toward the cafe entrance for several seconds before finally looking back at him. Your son is terrifying, I muttered quietly. Vincent smiled into his cup. Adrian hears that often. Does he enjoy it? No, his answer surprised me enough to pull my attention fully back to him. Vincent leaned slightly forward across the table, lowering his voice. My son learned very young that fear keeps dangerous people predictable. Something in the way he said dangerous people made my stomach tighten again. I looked down at my untouched coffee. What exactly does your son do? Vincent's eyes flickered briefly toward the window where two security men stood near the SUVs. He protects what belongs to him. That was not an answer. Before I could press further, my manager rushed toward our booth looking pale and nervous. Claire, he whispered urgently. There is someone outside asking for you. Anxiety hit instantly. Who? Your landlord. Of course. I closed my eyes briefly before standing from the booth. Excuse me. Vincent nodded calmly. Take your time. Snow slapped against my face the second I stepped outside the cafe. Mr. Collins stood beneath the awning near the curb, his thick scarf wrapped tightly against the cold. But unlike last night, his usual irritation seemed gone completely. He looked nervous. Actually nervous. Miss Bennett, he said quickly the second he saw me. I need to apologize. I blinked in confusion. What? Snow crunched beneath polished dress, shoes behind me. I turned instinctively and froze. Adrian stood several feet away near the black SUVs, one hand tucked calmly into the pocket of his dark wool coat. Snow drifted through his dark hair, while two men remained nearby at a respectful distance. He looked composed, untouchable, like winter itself had decided to wear an Armani coat. Mr. Collins swallowed hard before continuing. There has been a misunderstanding regarding your apartment. My confusion deepened. A misunderstanding? The eviction notice has been withdrawn. My breath caught instantly. What? In fact, he continued quickly, your rent has been fully covered for the next 12 months. The city noise around me suddenly felt distant. Covered by who? But I already knew. Slowly, I turned toward Adrian. His expression remained unreadable beneath the falling snow. You had no right, I whispered. He walked toward me with measured calm until only a few feet separated us. Up close, his green eyes looked even colder against the storm. Your mother should not worry about losing her home. That is not your decision to make. No, he agreed quietly. It is mine. The absolute certainty in his voice sent heat rushing through my chest. Not fear this time. Frustration. You cannot just buy people's problems away. Adrian studied me silently for several seconds while snow gathered against the shoulders of his black coat. Most people would say thank you. Most people are probably smarter than me. Something almost dangerous flickered behind his eyes then. Not anger exactly. Interest. No, he said softly. Most people would have accepted the money yesterday morning and forgotten an old man by nightfall. The words hit harder than I expected. I looked away first. Snow crunched beneath passing footsteps while yellow taxi lights blurred through the storm behind him. I did not help your father because I wanted something, I whispered tiredly. Adrian's expression softened so slightly, I almost missed it. I know. Silence settled between us again, heavy with cold air and things neither of us fully understood yet. Then his gaze shifted briefly toward the cafe window where Vincent watched us with visible amusement. My father wants you to have dinner with us tonight. My eyes widened immediately. Absolutely not. Claire. The way he said my name stopped me before I could continue walking away. Calm. Low. Controlled. It is only dinner. I folded my arms tightly against the freezing wind. People like you do not invite people like me to dinner for no reason. Adrian stepped closer until the falling snow blurred everything except those pale green eyes locked onto mine. You are right, he said quietly. We do not. By 7 that evening, I had changed outfits 4 times and regretted agreeing to dinner at least 20. The small apartment bathroom mirror reflected a version of me that looked exhausted no matter what I wore. Dark circles beneath gray-blue eyes. Hair refusing to cooperate. A black dress I had not touched since a cousin's wedding 3 years ago because it was the only thing in my closet that looked remotely appropriate for whatever this night was supposed to be. My mother watched me carefully from the couch while the old radiator hissed beside her. You like him, she said softly. I nearly dropped my earring. Mom. I am not blind, Claire. He terrifies me. That does not answer my point. Heat rushed into my face immediately. I grabbed my coat before she could say anything else. Outside, Manhattan glittered beneath fresh snow and gold streetlights by the time the black SUV arrived exactly at 8. Of course it arrived exactly at 8. Men like Adrian Moretti probably scheduled their breathing. One of the security men stepped out first and opened the back door for me without speaking. The inside of the SUV smelled faintly like leather and cedarwood. Warm. Expensive. Dangerous in a strangely elegant way. Adrian sat across from me, wearing another black suit that somehow looked even sharper than the coat from earlier. No tie tonight. Just the open collar of a white dress shirt beneath a charcoal overcoat. His green eyes lifted briefly from his phone the second I entered the vehicle. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds. Long enough to make my pulse stumble anyway. You came, he said quietly. I frowned as the SUV pulled away from the curb. You sound surprised. Most people do not say no to me. Directly. That sounds unhealthy. Something faintly amused touched his mouth before disappearing again. Silence settled between us as snow blurred past the tinted windows. The city looked different from inside this car. Cleaner somehow. Further away. I folded my hands tightly together in my lap. So where exactly are we going? Home. The single word should not have affected me the way it did. But hearing someone like Adrian Moretti say home felt strangely intimate. 20 minutes later, the SUV turned through massive iron gates overlooking the East River. My breath caught before I could stop it. The estate looked less like a home and more like something pulled from an old movie. Stone walls. Tall glowing windows. Snow-covered gardens lit by soft golden lights. The kind of wealth ordinary people only saw in magazines while eating instant noodles in studio apartments. This is your house, I whispered. Adrian glanced toward me calmly. One of them. Of course it was one of them. The front doors opened before we even reached the entrance. Staff members greeted Adrian quietly as we stepped inside the mansion's marble foyer. Everything smelled like polished wood and expensive candles. Warm light reflected across black marble floors while a massive chandelier glowed overhead like falling stars. I suddenly became painfully aware that my entire life could probably fit inside one of the closets here. Claire. Vincent's voice echoed warmly from the dining room. He looked entirely different tonight, too. Fresh suit, silver cufflinks, hair neatly combed back. Yet somehow his smile remained exactly the same as the man holding soup beside a bakery window. You clean up well, he teased gently. You lied to me, I replied before I could stop myself. Vincent laughed openly. Fair criticism. Adrian pulled out my chair at the dining table before sitting beside me. The movement was so natural it startled me more than the mansion had. The dining room overlooked the river through enormous glass windows where snow drifted softly across the dark water outside. Candlelight flickered against crystal glasses while staff quietly served dinner with practiced precision. I stared down at the place setting in front of me. 3 forks, 2 wine glasses, probably enough silverware to cover my rent for 6 months. Relax, Adrian murmured beside me, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. Nobody here expects perfection. I looked sideways at him carefully. Easy for you to say. You were probably born knowing which fork is for salad. For the first time all night, Adrian actually smiled. Small, real, brief enough that I almost thought I imagined it. But suddenly the terrifying man beside me looked younger somehow, less untouchable. Then Vincent lifted his wine glass and said quietly, to the woman who reminded my son that good people still exist. The room fell silent after that. And for reasons I could not explain, Adrian never looked away from me once. The dinner should have felt uncomfortable. It should have felt impossible to breathe inside a room where crystal glasses probably cost more than my monthly paycheck and men in tailored suits quietly guarded the hallways outside. Instead, somehow it felt warm. Vincent told stories through most of the meal while snow drifted softly against the massive windows overlooking the river. Stories about growing up in Brooklyn 50 years ago, about sneaking into Yankees games with his brothers, about meeting Adrian's mother at an Italian bakery when he was 22 and too broke to afford flowers. Every time he mentioned her, something subtle changed in Adrian's face. The coldness eased slightly, like grief still lived quietly beneath all that control. My mother loved feeding people, Adrian said at one point, his voice calm as he cut into his steak. Our house was never empty. Vincent smiled faintly. She would have liked you, Claire. The comment caught me off guard badly enough that I nearly dropped my fork. You barely know me. Vincent took a slow sip of wine. Kindness tells me enough. I looked down at my plate, suddenly embarrassed by how easily these people spoke about me like I mattered. Nobody had looked at me this carefully in years. After dinner, Adrian walked me toward the balcony while staff quietly cleared the table behind us. The hallway lights glowed gold against dark marble floors as we stepped outside beneath the covered terrace overlooking the East River. Snow floated softly through the night air beyond the balcony railings while Manhattan glittered across the water like another world entirely. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself against the cold. You really did not have to pay my rent, I said quietly. Adrian stood beside me with one hand resting against the stone railing, black coat shifting slightly in the wind. You keep saying that. Because it is true. He looked toward the city skyline instead of at me. Do you know what most people ask me for within 5 minutes of meeting me? Money. Usually. His mouth curved faintly without humor. Sometimes favors. Sometimes protection. Most people see me and immediately calculate what they can gain. I studied him carefully in the soft balcony light. And what do you gain? Finally, his green eyes shifted toward mine. Calm. Heavy. Impossible to fully read. Peace. The answer surprised me enough that I forgot to breathe for half a second. Adrian looked back toward the river again. My world is loud, Claire. Constantly loud. Men competing for power. Loyalty bought instead of earned. Everyone pretending to be something dangerous. Snow drifted slowly through the dark around us while his voice lowered almost thoughtfully. Then my father comes home talking about a waitress who spent her last $12 feeding a stranger. Something tightened painfully in my chest. You keep making that sound heroic. Maybe because it is. The sincerity in his voice unsettled me more than his coldness ever had. I looked away first. I am just trying to survive. Adrian stepped slightly closer beside me. Close enough now that I could catch the faint scent of cedarwood and winter air clinging to his coat. That is exactly why it mattered. Silence stretched gently between us. Not awkward. Something quieter. More dangerous somehow. You know, I said softly. Normal rich people usually send thank you cards. Adrian's eyes darkened with what looked suspiciously like amusement again. I have never been accused of being normal. I laughed before I could stop myself. The sound escaped into the cold air unexpectedly, and for the first time all evening Adrian looked genuinely caught off guard by something. His expression softened almost instantly afterward. Not cold now. Not intimidating. Just watching me in silence beneath the falling snow. Then his phone buzzed sharply inside his coat pocket. The moment shattered immediately. Adrian glanced at the screen, and all warmth disappeared from his face so fast it made my stomach tighten. His jaw hardened slightly. His eyes turned unreadable again. Dangerous again. What is it? I asked carefully. Adrian slid the phone back into his pocket without answering. Below us near the gates, black SUVs suddenly rolled into the driveway one after another, headlights cutting through the snowstorm. Men in dark coats moved quickly across the property below. Something had changed. I could feel it instantly. Adrian looked down toward the arriving vehicles before turning back toward me. Claire, he said quietly, his voice suddenly colder than the winter air around us. I need you to stay inside tonight. The warmth from the balcony vanished the second Adrian spoke. I felt it immediately, in the tension around his eyes, in the way security men moved quickly across the snowy courtyard below, like something important had shifted beneath the surface of the night. The black SUVs continued arriving one after another beyond the gates while cold wind swept across the terrace hard enough to sting my face. What is happening? I asked quietly. Adrian kept his gaze fixed on the driveway below. Business. That is a very suspicious answer. Normally, that might have earned another faint smile from him. Tonight it did not. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he turned toward me fully. Claire. His voice dropped lower, more serious than I had heard before. I need you to trust me for the next hour. Trust. The word hit strangely coming from someone like Adrian Moretti, a man who looked built from secrets and silence. Before I could answer, Vincent stepped onto the balcony behind us with a calmness that made no sense considering the tension below. You look exactly like your mother when you worry, he told Adrian softly. Adrian exhaled slowly through his nose. This is not the same. No, Vincent agreed. Because this time you actually care. Silence followed instantly. Heavy silence. Adrian looked away first, but not before I caught something flash briefly across his face. Vulnerability. Gone almost immediately beneath control again. Vincent walked toward us and rested one hand against the balcony railing while snow drifted through the darkness around us. Claire, he said gently, would you mind keeping an old man company inside for a little while? I looked between father and son carefully. You are making this sound very dramatic. Vincent smiled faintly. That is because my son enjoys dramatics. Father, you wear black coats like a movie villain, Adrian. Against all logic, I laughed softly. The sound surprised all three of us. Adrian shook his head once, something almost human returning briefly to his expression again. Inside, he said quietly, please. The word please from him felt strangely important. I nodded slowly before following Vincent back through the massive glass doors into the mansion. Warmth wrapped around us immediately again, while staff moved discreetly through the hallways pretending not to notice the tension outside. But I noticed. Everyone noticed. The entire house felt alert somehow. Waiting. Vincent guided me toward a sitting room lined with dark wood bookshelves and a fireplace crackling softly against the storm outside. You are afraid of him, Vincent observed calmly as we sat down. I hesitated. I do not know what he is. Vincent studied the fire for a moment before answering. Adrian grew up in a world where kindness was usually a trick. His pale blue eyes shifted toward me again. Then he met someone who offered it freely. My chest tightened unexpectedly. I barely know him. That has never stopped the important things. Before I could respond, the sitting room doors opened quietly. Adrian stepped inside alone now, snow melting slowly against the shoulders of his black coat. But something had changed again. The coldness was gone. Not completely. Just hidden beneath exhaustion instead. Vincent stood slowly. Everything handled? Adrian nodded. Once. Yes. The older man studied his son for a few seconds before smiling faintly. Good. Then I will leave you two alone before you scare the poor girl completely. I am already scared, I admitted softly. Vincent laughed under his breath as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving sudden silence behind him. Adrian removed his coat slowly and draped it over a chair near the fire. Without the heavy winter layers, he somehow looked less untouchable. Still powerful, still dangerous, but tired now too. Human, I am sorry about tonight, he said quietly. You should not have been pulled into any of this. I looked up at him carefully across the firelight. Then why do I feel like you are not going to let me walk away from it either? Adrian held my gaze for a long moment while flames flickered gold across the sharp lines of his face. Then he finally answered in the quietest voice I had heard from him yet. Because people like you are rare, Claire. My heartbeat stumbled softly against my ribs. Adrian stepped closer to the fireplace, green eyes steady on mine. And rare things, he said quietly, become very difficult to lose.